Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Kristen and this is the first episode of Fix My Dry Inks. Today I'm going to be testing out Ferris Wheel Press Little Robinia. This is actually one of the first inks that I had purchased in the beginning of my fountain pen journey, and I have tried so many times. Yeah, this thing is half full because I've tried so many times to make it work for me. I have not had a successful writing session with this fountain pen ink. The only way that I've been able to make such light and dry inks like this work is by adding a wetter or a darker ink color to this. But really what I want is the color of Little Robinia writing wet in any of the fountain pens that I use. So I am going to be adding White Lightning to the mix. So this White Lightning ink additive I purchased on the Vanness Pens website, and it's for use in pour flowing or dry inks to increase flow consistency. So it's most effective when used at a concentration of less than 1%, maybe a drop for every 10 to 12 milliliters that you have. I'm not going to put White Lightning in the bottle of ink itself because just in case something goes wrong, I'll still have the majority of my ink undiluted if I need to start from scratch. So what I'm going to do is have a control sample first. So I'm going to ink this up with Ferris Wheel Press Little Robinia. Then I'm going to write a little bit. This is the notebook that I have started using recently to kind of show or give an example of how some of my pen and ink pairings are behaving. I guess I should tell you why I selected this pen. The fountain pen that I chose is the Pilot Kakano, and I selected this fountain pen because it is not very expensive and it has a very reliable medium nib, and it's also very easy to clean. Okay, so I was actually expecting a super dry, almost impossible experience, but it turned out to be mostly fine. It felt like it began writing drier and drier by the end, but I really think, is this my first time ever trying dry inks in this fountain pen? Because the Pilot Kakano, it worked. Oh my gosh. It worked so much better than I thought that it would. So now that I have used this ink to write a full page of text, I'm going to go ahead and dilute this ink with the White Lightning ink additive. I'm going to go ahead and, I don't know if you can see that it's very difficult to actually, even with the little, are they called ball bearings? It's still very difficult to break the surface tension of this ink. I believe that's pretty much what the White Lightning does. It really reduces the surface tension of the ink itself. It's so that right there, all the ink is stuck up here. Even with agitators in the converter, it's still very difficult for the ink itself to move around and flow freely. That is not very much ink coming out of here, so I'm going to put a little bit more ink into this ink vial so that it's not so heavily affected by the White Lightning ink additive. Okay, so I will put 1 milliliter, 2 milliliters. So I'll try and get 2 milliliters of ink in here. I'm going to go clean this out so that I can dip it into the White Lightning ink additive. So you can probably see right now that the ink really is just, there's so much surface tension going on with this ink that it doesn't exactly, it's not grabbing onto the sides of the vial. And that's one thing that I noticed when I first used White Lightning ink additive in one of my other inks, one of my previous inks. So let's see. Since this is not a full 10 or 12 milliliters of ink, I'm not going to put a full drop of ink additive in here. What I'm going to do is just dip it into the additive, get rid of all the extra drops off of it, and then dip this wet tip into the ink itself. Do you see that blue? This ink additive is like a bluish purple color. That is quite interesting, and it is not because of that. It is blue, like a purple color. Just dip this down in here, but I'm going to get rid of that extra drop at the very end. And that is all I'm going to use in my 2 milliliters of ink. So now I'm going to open this up and dip this wet tip in. I guess I can swirl it around just a tad. And now you can actually see this ink coating the sides of the vial. So if I bring this over so that you can see the back. Look at that, how it coats the sides, the insides of the vial now. And now we should have a very reliable, much wetter ink to use in our pilot Kakano. Let's ink up this pen again. And it was so much easier to ink up this time as well. Interesting. Let's see if there's going to be a difference in the writing samples. Ooh, okay. Definitely a wetter ink. Let's take a look at the writing samples side by side. I'll say that I definitely got a more consistent, a deeper purple with the ink additive. For the undiluted ink, it looks like there was much more shading and it felt pretty dry and not lubricated by the end of the writing sample. And here there was a much more consistent writing experience from the beginning all the way down to the end of the writing session. And there are some places where the ink pools, I can actually see more of a pinker color. And also up here at the top, there was a slight mishap with a little bit too much ink flowing to the nib. But that was the only time that I experienced an issue with ink flow. Everywhere else, it was a very pleasant experience. It does not feel like a super wet ink, but it was definitely a much more pleasant experience than just the ink without an additive. That's a side-by-side comparison of Little Robinia with and without White Lightning ink additive. Okay, so I wanted to come back and give a few more thoughts about my experiences with Ferris Wheel Press Little Robinia, the Pilot Kakuno, and the Vanness Pens White Lightning ink additive. Before we go there, I want to back up to my first ever writing experience with Ferris Wheel Press Little Robinia. This was actually inked up very early on in my fountain pen journey. It was inked up in a TWSBI Diamond 580, and it was so pleasantly wet here at the very beginning. Oh, I just loved it. But then you see all the shading here, and then it became almost unreadable at the very end. It was very frustrating to go from here, thinking that this was the perfect ink for me, down to here, wondering, what have I done? What happened? So that was my first ever experience. My next few experiences were attempting to make this ink more legible. And so I've mixed it up with 4 parts Little Robinia and 2 parts Grape Ice Pop. It was nice. I went to a 5:1 ratio because I really wanted this Little Robinia color and I was not getting it. This is 5 parts Little Robinia, 1 part Grape Ice Pop. And it was still too dark. So I figured that I would try to use it in another fountain pen, which actually was the Pilot Kakuno. I wish I had dated these things. This was late last year during Simone's ink swap. So I was trying out some things. And so I wrote with it one more time to see if it would actually perform properly. And it did. There was no skipping. There were no hard starts throughout the entire writing experience. But as I got towards the end, there was still quite a bit of shading to the point where it looked like there were hard starts, even though there were not. It wasn't very legible. Let's move on to this month, July 2023. This was when I tried it again. This is Ferris Wheel Press Little Robinia with nothing added. So it was nice. It was a bit dry and shading started to increase towards the end of the writing sample. And this is after adding just a little bit of White Lightning ink additive. It was okay, but I wanted a little bit more because I remember how juicy and wet Colorverse Dan Huang was when I added the ink additive. So I wanted that same experience with Little Robinia. And I did get a better experience by adding just a tad bit more of the ink additive. And this is the writing sample once I did that. So I just repeated the same process. Empty this pen back into the ink vial Yeah, there were 2 milliliters of this version of Little Robinia. And I just dipped the syringe one more time. I put in that blunt syringe with the excess drop into the sample, stirred it up, and this is the writing sample that I have from that process. Now, this is so much more consistent from stroke to stroke. On here, you'll see that some of the lighter strokes, maybe the upstrokes and the quicker writing, the areas where I wrote a little bit faster. So right here, the G in the word night, the curve in the uppercase D here, you'll see that those lighter strokes are actually thinner than some of the others. So this shading also has line variation in here. So it's nice. It gives the ink personality, but I actually prefer the look of this experience. The wetter writing Little Robinia with a little bit extra white lightning gives me a much more consistent line width from the lighter areas all the way to the darker areas. So it doesn't look like there are any areas here. See, for this G and night, that G is just as thick as the N over here. It's just as thick. This N is just as thick as the T at the end of this word. I really like White Lightning ink additive because it turned this experience into this experience. And this is so much more pleasant in a fountain pen nib. This is not the most glossy, slippery, glassy nib that you will ever come across. But with White Lightning, it became a much more pleasant experience. I'm definitely going to do this experiment with other fountain pens, but I really wanted to try it in a fountain pen that was pretty easy to clean and maintain. I am much more confident that White Lightning is going to help me out with some of these ink colors that I really do enjoy. I think that this is opening up an opportunity for me to enjoy lighter, drier inks because I can make them do this even if they don't come like this out of the box. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or comments, if you have any prior experience with White Lightning ink additive, please leave that expertise in the comment section below, and I will see you all in the next video. Have a good day. Bye-bye.